Movement unit is on Roosevelt and Taft. So Teddy Roosevelt was a governor of New York, and he worked to reform government and regulate business. Republican Party leaders trying to get rid of him convinced him to run as the vice president for William McKinley. And let me explain this a little more deeply. Roosevelt was very much of a reformer, and he wanted to get rid of a lot of corruption in government. And that made some of the people in the Republican Party uncomfortable, partly because they were some of the people he was going after. He was getting more and more popular nationwide, Teddy Roosevelt was. And one way to kind of hide someone who's more popular is to make that person vice president, because the vice president has very little power. And you would think that you would become more noteworthy as vice president, but if you go back through even recent history, most people don't remember vice presidents very much. Well, 6 months into his time as vice president, the president, William McKinley, is shot to death, and Roosevelt becomes president. So the thing they most were fearful of, Roosevelt gaining power, comes to pass. Now, Roosevelt brought his ideas of progressivism to the presidency. And we first see that in the United Mine Workers strike. The coal strike was devastating to the nation. The nation ran on coal, and in so many, it provided heat, it provided energy, it provided, in some areas, lights. It was the main source of energy, and this was a huge problem. And Roosevelt stepped in through arbitration, where the two sides allow a third party to settle. In this case, it was Roosevelt, and he convinced both sides to accept his plan to settle the strike. Both sides got some of what they wanted. And Roosevelt showed himself to be a very strong leader. And in 1904, he runs for re-election under the campaign of a square deal. His basic belief in balancing the interests of business, consumers, and workers was what the square deal was all about. So everybody would get a little bit of what they wanted, but he was trying to make sure that consumers and workers weren't ignored. And it really, as he was the front point of this idea of progressives. He wanted to limit the power of trusts and monopolies that we looked at under industrialization. He promoted public health and safety. He wanted to improve working conditions. Roosevelt considered big business essential to the nation's growth. He said that we are not attacking the corporations, but endeavoring to do away with any evil in them. We are not hostile to them. We are merely determined that they shall be so handled as to subserve the public good. We draw the line against misconduct, not against wealth. Roosevelt believed they should behave responsibly, that these trusts, these big companies should behave responsibly. He wanted to protect the environment, and Roosevelt recognized that natural resources are limited. He wanted to stop the loss of public lands to greed and mismanagement. Roosevelt set aside 150 million acres as forest reserves during his time as president. He doubled the number of national parks during his time as president. Now, in 1908, Roosevelt decides not to run for re-election, even though he could have, and gives support to his vice president, William Howard Taft, pictured on the right, and Roosevelt's on the left. And Taft is elected president. Taft did not want to overstep his boundaries as president. He was not as an assertive president, and as titled here, he's more of a reluctant progressive, especially compared to Roosevelt. He passed the Mann-Elkins Act to extend the powers of the Interstate Commerce Commission, and did add a large amount of land to national forest reserves. He created the Department of Labor to enforce labor laws, and helped get the 16th Amendment adopted, which was a graduated income tax to pay for government programs more fairly. So a graduated income tax is one that if you make less, you pay less in tax than a person who makes more. You pay a lower rate even of your income as tax. However, he angered many progressives. The Payne-Aldrich tariff in particular raised tariffs, and of course progressives favored low tariffs. Then there was a controversy around the Secretary of Interior Richard Ballinger, where Ballinger approved the sale of coal-rich Alaska timberlands. So some of this timber area in Alaska, areas that in the past Roosevelt would try to protect, Ballinger sold it to companies to extract the coal. The head of the U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, criticized Ballinger, and Taft fired him for criticizing. The firing of Pinchot led to a split between Taft and Roosevelt, and they really showed their difference of how they viewed even this idea of progressivism, where Roosevelt was this strong, assertive leader and was a progressive and wanted to be seen that way. Taft was much more reluctant. Even though he did progressive ideas too, he was much more on the spectrum of, if you remember our first big show, of progressivism and conservatism, he was closer to the conservative side than Roosevelt was. And that's our big show on Roosevelt and Taft.